And we are live. A very good day to everyone on the call and welcome to this webinar on effective capital base spend prioritization. Due to the limited time we have today, this will be a one-way call in terms of audio. If you have any questions or remarks, please use the chat function in the lower right corner of your screen to send any messages to me. Where possible, I will address your question during the call. For questions specific to your company or project, I am very happy to engage with you after the call as well. With that bit of housekeeping out of the way, let's move on to capital base spend prioritization and business case alignment. This is a topic very close to my heart. Time and again, businesses prove that a well-prioritized capital plan enables them to achieve above and beyond what they set out to do. The capital process is often the point where my involvement with the business starts. People come to me and they say, our approval process is slow. Projects typically overspend and are delivered late. And to top it off, the returns are most of the time well below the projections that we originally approved. What can we do to get better results from our capital budget and make it more effective? My answer to that question is twofold. First of all, you're not alone. McKinsey did a study into 5,400 major IT projects back in 2012. They found that on average, large IT projects run 45% over budget, 7% over time, while delivering 56% less value than predicted. Wow. I always ask my clients how they perform on these metrics, and I can tell you that projects of a non-IT nature perform within the same orders of magnitude, albeit typically somewhat lower than these findings for IT projects. The second part of my answer is release the power of pace to your capital projects. In today's webinar, I will give you a flavor of what that looks like. Here is my webinar promise to you. We've limited time at our hands today, so we'll restrict ourselves to just 3 objectives. These are, first of all, get an understanding of factors that inhibit effective prioritization of base capital projects. I will also give you some tips to help you get in control of the prioritization of base spend. And last but not least, and this is really an enabler for even more effective prioritization of future budgets, I will give you some best practice tips for capital proposals specifically of a base spend nature. Before we dive into that, here is a brief introduction. Most of you on the call will probably not have met me before. My name is Jos.vanrozen. My accent is imported from Holland. I am living and working in the UK and have been doing so for over 15 years now. I am a decision coach and PACE consultant. PACE is a program I have developed from a long history of corporate roles where I was working with project teams to prepare investment proposals, both for capital and for M&A, for board approval. Whenever I worked with a project team on a proposal, I found myself sending the team longer and longer emails about what they should not be doing, and I realized there was an enormous amount of repetition in those emails from project to project. Ultimately, that long string of emails evolved into a workshop, and the workshop evolved into a fully fledged program called PACE. In a nutshell, project proposals prepared with PACE are approved significantly faster. They are also implemented on time, on budget, and with results in line with expectations. Effectively, I offer 2 different services with the PACE program. I help individual professionals to refine their skills in such a way that their proposals will be approved faster and the project results will be better than before. This is done through a webinar series of 5 half-hour sessions called PACE 101. This covers the life of a capital project all the way from problem identification through to capturing results and learning lessons. Participants get to practice the learned skills, and their work also gets reviewed by me, so they really understand what they should focus on as they apply the principles going forward. For corporate groups, I facilitate in-company PACE workshops. These are typically for a cross-functional mix of people. The workshops take 2 full days and aim to achieve behavioral change in a team, department, or organization. Now this is a very intensive program that really achieves transformational results, and I will show you some soon. PACE already works very well in an individual setting. However, the big rewards for an organization come from having all stakeholders singing from the same hymn sheet and applying the principles as a team. So I can hear you wonder, what is PACE? Well, PACE is a framework. It stands for Project Analysis Capability Enhancement, and it is really a framework for capital investment planning, portfolio management, allocation of resources, assessment and approval of projects, as well as the effective capturing and leveraging of project review findings. That last bit, leveraging project review findings, is often a hidden gem for people. A lot of organizations have a requirement to do post-project evaluations. However, these are rarely completed because many businesses perceive project evaluations as labor-intensive and pretty low in value. PACE turns this notion upside down and extracts maximum value with a light process that focuses on lessons learned for future use. So really it's a whole load of things in one. And people often ask me, well, how can you really do that? Especially since there is no system. The answer is quite simple. Every one of us knows already how to take decisions. We take decisions every day. The interesting thing though is that when we take decisions not for our own account but for our employer's account, we forget a lot of the principles. That's partly because we are part of a large organization and dependent on more people. It's partly because the numbers are bigger than what we deal with at home. And it's partly because of the sense of responsibility is not quite the same. And that's where some of the behavior starts to diverge. PACE is essentially a set of known concepts strung together in a way that helps people engage with any kind of project. PACE makes them feel as if they're spending their own money and to feel responsible for it in that way. I have been working with PACE independently for a number of years now, and here are some of the results that clients report about PACE. They find that approval times for investment proposals shrink drastically, in some cases by up to 90%. Think about what you can do if you get projects approved a lot faster. This means faster implementation, but it also frees up time as less time is used to reiterate and sell the project inside the organization. Many of my clients have eliminated capital budget carryovers. So that means what you say you're going to spend on a project in a given year is actually spent in that year. This also means that projects are ready to deliver results sooner. Also, financial assumptions have been improved. This means more reliable projections, less budget shifts, less supplementary budget requests, so overspends, and more timely executions. Also, resource allocation to priority projects improves, and there are also less rush projects of a firefighting nature as a result. What I find interesting is that once companies get comfortable with PACE in capital, they start applying it to other business functions like M&A, innovation management, pricing decisions, and even the improvement of relationships with suppliers and customers. What doesn't show on the slide here is that a number of clients have achieved a vast increase in capital budget by applying PACE. In some cases, it has even doubled. You would think that's counterintuitive, since the capital budget is usually associated with cuts. But think about it for a moment. If you doubled your capital budget, that's really a reflection of capital effectiveness and adding value to your business. Many CFOs and shareholders would be salivating at that kind of results. Now, I'd like to get a bit of input from yourselves as well. If you can use, please, the chat function in the lower right corner of your screen, here is a question for you. Can you give me an indication of, roughly, how much of your organization's budget is carried over every year? If you can just type your percentage figure into the chat field and hit send, or you can send me a range as well. Okay, that's the first ones. 40, 25, 30, 30, 40, 30, 30, 25, 15, a few more 40s, there's a few more coming in, but that really gives you a flavor of how much capital budget is carried over every year. Thank you for your answers, by the way. In part, this is explained by multi-year projects. In other words, a project that runs for more than 1 year. Of course, that will have a carryover effect. But time and again, clients tell me that the bulk of their carryover is caused by projects being approved late and by implementation delays. All this translates into missed opportunities to capture those early results that weigh so heavily in the NPV and the payback indicators. Here's another question. What is base capital? It's probably good to define that here, since people sometimes work with slightly different perspectives. For me, base capital comprises all the projects you can't afford not to do. If you don't spend it, you are going to lose something you have already. Typically a part of your business that is running well, but just needs to be maintained. This cartoon is a bit of a joke. However, as a side note, it makes an important point in the headline. From time to time, we have to consciously decide the things that we are not going to do. This will remove distraction and absorption of capital funds from the business. We'll come back to that in a moment. Here's another question for you. Again, please use the chat function of your webinar toolkit. Can you tell me how much of your capital budget is base spent? 50, 35, 55, 42, that's very precise, 70, 60, 40 to 50 range, 50, 40. Okay, it looks like it's around the halfway mark. That's quite a large number to spend just to keep what you've got. Let's take a look first of all at what are the inhibitors to effective base spend prioritization. There are things that we do too much of and there are things that we do too little of. Politics is definitely something that many organizations do too much of. There is an element, of course, of prestige around having a large capital budget, and sometimes the general manager with the loudest voice gets the number that they want. Sometimes base spend is used as a political tool to say, oh, we need to spend all this money, otherwise we are just going to fall apart. If senior management at corporate level listens to those voices all the time, will there be any money left for those other units with growth opportunities or cost reduction initiatives? Now, by the way, you can deal with politics by encouraging people to deal more in facts underpinned with a solid point of view. Another inhibitor is too much focus on the capital budget. Of course, there has to be a budget. However, typically the budgeting process is marred by units over-asking with the assumption in mind that their request is going to be cut, so that they end up with what they really needed in the first place. I'm sure that some of you on the call will be nodding in agreement here. Some general managers also hold back part of their budget until late in the year for emergencies. This is really behavior that destroys value. For real emergencies, you can be sure that any healthy corporation will always be able to arrange the funding. Base spend budgets are also often based on history. It's another issue, and it can cause misallocations of the past to be repeated in the future. So maybe it's a good time to ask yourself, is that something that's happening in our organization? There are also things that we do too little of. First of all, context is often overlooked. Much more important than funding availability is having in place the capability to get the project done. It's no use including projects in your plan that you won't have the resource for to complete them in the first place. However, very often the resource question is overlooked, not necessarily on an individual project basis, but certainly on an aggregate basis where you will find resources being over-allocated. Also, dependencies are part of context. Do we understand what other projects and business aspects are dependent on this project being done? And does this project depend on any other projects being done to get the results we want? I will give you an example here. A few years ago I was working with a bottling business that bottled non-alcoholic drinks. They had bought into this notion of prioritization of base spend. Their typical base spend items were things like bottling line replacements, warehousing, water treatment plants, and glass. This business operated with a model of returnable glass bottles where the bottles had an average useful life of about 5 years. As a result, glass was treated as a capital item and part of the capital budget. Now, when this business put together its draft strategic plan, they looked at the relative attractiveness of its various components and realized that glass bottles had the lowest returns of the lot. As a result, glass replacement had the lowest priority in the base spend budget. And this really is where the notion of dependency comes in. You can replace all the bottling lines that you want, but if you don't invest in glass bottle replacements, you won't have any bottles to put the drinks in. In other words, it's very important to look at the project not just in isolation, but also see how does it enable other things to happen. In this case, the glass bottles enable the bottling lines to run and generate output. A third component of context is strategy. It is imperative to have a clear overview of the strategies that are supported by respective capital projects and to look out for strategies that are over or underrepresented when it comes to capital allocation. Now keep in mind, not all strategies are capital intensive, but a situation of chronic over or underfunding should never come as a surprise, so it's something you should look out for. Related to the notion of strategy is the issue of too little focus on the time window. Typically, the capital investment window is a 12-month window. Suppose you had a business, facility, or other profit stream that has a requirement for heavy base spending for a number of years in a row. Because of this typical 12-month window each year, the protected profit stream is used as the justification to invest more base capital. However, profit once used as a justification really should not be used again, but it often is. In other words, when you know you have a number of big projects coming up in the next few years, it is important to have an overview of the total spend the profit stream is going to require to just keep what you have, because only that way can you make an informed decision about supporting the profit stream with the required base spend. Otherwise you are going to end up approving a roof replacement one year, a water treatment plant the next, and a regulatory energy plant upgrade the year after that. The last thing we typically do too little of is quantification of base spend benefits. There are a number of reasons for that. The most important behavioral reason I have seen is where people work on the assumption that the base spend project is going to happen anyway. An analyst will be asked to prepare a request for authorization or an investment proposal. The benefits are obviously going to be large, but difficult to quantify without contention. Hence, it is often more practical to just go with low, undisputed benefits, and I've very often seen zero. However, it doesn't make for a pretty picture. In this chart here, you can see how a business has allocated an amount to defensive projects and is not expecting any crystallized return on that spend, but they are the projects that they choose to do first. For the margin improvement projects, such as growth, mix improvement, and cost reduction, a basic prioritization has occurred based on incremental returns. And the business is going to do the projects with the highest margin improvement returns first. But actually, this is really quite a misrepresentation of the real returns. This is shown in the next slide, and it really makes the point that base spend projects should be about the most wanted projects around. The stigma is just one of relatively boring replacement activity. Another word for base spend is maintenance spend, and sometimes people jokingly talk about other people being high maintenance, and the definition of high maintenance then is high spending, no return. But really, high maintenance items are typically also ones that generate a high return if you really value to keep what you have. So that's the litmus test here. Do you want to keep what you have? Is that really worth it? That's the question. The caveat here, though, is what I pointed out before about benefits only being used once to justify an investment. To do this well requires really a good understanding of the potential reach of the project, but even more importantly, where that reach stops. Here's another question for you. Would you invest your own money in your company's usual capital project proposals? Please use again the chat function in your webinar toolbox. No, 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 yes, no, no, sometimes, no, not most of the time, no, no, yes, no, no, no. Well, you get the picture. Most people are, to say the least, pretty cautious about investing their own money in company projects. Typically, when people are heavily involved with a project they're about to propose, they're much more likely to answer this question with a yes. However, those who have worked in business for a number of years have learned that if you added up the returns projected by all approved capital proposals, you will get a figure that is a lot larger than the returns achieved by the business. Something that McKinsey found as well. What excites me is that when I ask this question to people who work with PACE, the proportion of yes answers is in the majority, and it grows the longer PACE has been established. And you can get there too. Here are my tips for putting together effective business cases for base spend projects, because that is really the enabler for leveraging your capital budget. That's where the rubber hits the road. First of all, have a very clear point of view on your base case. What I mean with the base case is the status quo. Paint a clear picture of what you think is going to happen to your asset and your underlying profit stream if you don't do anything at all, because that really makes the point to reviewers and approvers whether the project is either urgent, important, or both. Here is an illustration of how you can do that. A number of years ago, I worked with a manufacturing business. The system they were using to control their manufacturing was declared obsolete and no longer supported by Siemens, the supplier. This meant that Siemens would no longer be selling spare parts nor train engineers to maintain these systems. However, spare parts would still be available on the second-hand market, and trained engineers were likely to be around for some time to come. The project team translated this information into a picture of the implications for the asset's performance, where the availability of spare parts and trained engineers, and the quality of both over time, were the main ingredients of the analysis, and I think you can see that here. They developed a worst case and a best case scenario, the blue and the red line over here. This provided them with a range of outcomes within which the future was likely to unfold, and served as a very useful basis for discussion with senior management. It enabled the business to feel confident that they would be right to invest in a newer generation system within the next 2 years, and helped the manufacturing team to put contingency plans in place to ensure high asset performance for the time window until the replacement had been achieved. Many base spend projects are about loss avoidance. The irony of those situations really is that most of the time you don't want to be in a situation where you are proven right about the assumed future losses. However, at the same time, having a substantiated point of view about how you expect asset performance to be affected in the base case gives a big booster to the credibility of the capital proposal. In addition, what it also does is it helps to manage risk for the base case scenario if that is what the business chooses to go with. The next thing you should really work on is to articulate a credible optimized base case. An optimized base case is probably best described as what would you do, what would you really do if you wanted to protect the profit stream associated with the asset at stake, but you couldn't really spend the money to make the replacement investment. In other words, if you would have to work with your existing tools and you wanted to protect part or all of the profit stream at stake, what would you do? Can you, if we talk about a manufacturing line, can you reallocate some of the production to other lines in your network, or can you outsource some of the production, or perhaps rationalize some of the output of the line so that you can only sell the products that make the largest margins? What are the things that you can do to keep what you have without making the replacement spend? The optimized base case has to be a credible one. It has to be well thought through. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, but it's always very exciting to see how creative people get in terms of getting results with low spend alternatives. And the optimized base case is then really what you want to compare the replacement spend scenario against. That's the high cost alternative. This will provide much more realistic return outcomes compared to what many people have shown historically. What I always find exciting in real life is that very often once people start working with optimized base cases, they end up proposing the optimized base case as the proposed action rather than the replacement investment. Of course, this is not the case all the time, but it's a pleasing number of times that it actually happens. And you can imagine that there's a lot of value in that. The third point is really the point about an honest set of implicit assumptions. Implicit assumptions are those things that we take for granted. We take for granted that the sun rises every day, but in our investment proposals, we typically take for granted things like the availability of sufficient energy, heat, clean water, skilled labor. Those are the type of things, typically things more of an infrastructure type of nature, like a roof, things that are shared with other activities in the same location or revenue stream. The point about making the list of implicit assumptions is not to make the list, but once you make the list, and when you do, I would encourage you strongly not to do it in isolation, but to ask the people that you work with on your project team or people on the fringes and ask them, what have I taken for granted that really makes a difference to the project becoming a success or a failure? And once you have that list, it forces you then almost to also tick off the list and say, well, which are the things that I need to investigate further because actually I am not so sure. And that really will be another credibility booster for your capital project. Quantifying defensive returns is really worth a separate slide, and here we go. It's an ABC approach, if you like. First of all, base spend projects are often about avoided losses. So think through all the things that you are preventing or avoiding by making the replacement spend. Now, avoided losses are typically very large, and the reason is that you are protecting something that's already existing. It's an existing profit stream that you are trying to keep in place. So it's running at full throttle. There's no ramp-up case like with growth mix type spend. So the benefits should be large because the run rate is there and typically the volume is there as well. So it's not strange that the benefits are large. C, consider the foundation or enabling role, and this comes back to the point that I made with the illustration around the glass bottles as well. Think about the dependencies. What else does this investment enable the business to do? Certainly in cases with uncertainty, dare to work with ranges. If you don't know exactly what's going to happen, paint a picture of your best case, your assumed best case, your assumed worst case, and work within the range that emerges. That really provides a platform for discussion from which you can then decide, do you like the range, or is it something that you wouldn't even want to venture into? Or would you only want to venture into part of the range, and can you do something about it so that you don't venture into the part of the range that you don't like? And related to that point, extremes are great for crystallizing issues, because if you ask yourself, well, what if our problem doubled within the span of a year, or if it halved within the span of a year, or if we invested twice as much as we are proposing, or only half as much, what would that do? What would it mean? Would we still be happy that we made our investment? And it really, when you work with extremes, it can really help you define the rules of the game. Here is my summary slide for you for achieving an effective capital base budget. You won't be surprised that it's very important to combine your needs with the capability to deliver. Can you actually do it? Crystallize dependencies. What does this investment enable the business to do? Align with strategy, of course, is very important, but as important is, are there parts of strategy that are absorbing a disproportionate amount of capital, and is that really sustainable long term? Typically, the business plan period is not the right time of year to have a deep strategic discussion, but the least you can do is flag this to be taken into account whenever there's the next strategic plan review, so that strategies that should be reviewed are included in the process. Uncertainties are often swept under the carpet. I would encourage you to really acknowledge them and address them. Work with ranges where you can, but even if you don't really know how to tackle them, talk about them. Say, these are the things that we would love to know how they're going to pan out, or that we would need to know more about to really make a more defined investment. Talking about it in your investment proposal really enables the discussion with the decision makers to say, well, this is something that we like, or can we start with something smaller to see how the future is going to pan out and learn some lessons. Those are the type of things that acknowledging uncertainties can result into. And last but not least, include thorough points of view in a business case. Remember the case about Siemens that I showed the range picture of. That was really a well thought through point of view on the performance of the asset over a span of time, taking into account availability of spare parts and trained engineers. And it's defining what are the key issues, what are the key drivers of a business case, and having some clear assumptions underpin that analysis that can make a big difference to you as a project team understanding the situation a lot better, and decision makers then to get a much clearer idea of what's the issue and making their own assessment of how they feel about it. As next steps for you after this webinar, I suggest you review whether your base spend budgeting practice is effective enough. Also ask yourself and those you work with whether they would invest their own money in the company's capital proposals. If the answers to those questions leave you with a fuzzy feeling in your tummy, I can strongly recommend to sign up for the PACE 101 webinar series. You will receive an email about it in the next 24 hours, or alternatively do get in touch with me to discuss how a PACE workshop could help your business to significantly leverage your capital budget and project management resources. If you're watching this as a replay, my email address is jos.vanrozen@vanrozenconsulting.com. I'll spell it for you, jos.vanrozen@vanrozenconsulting.com. On that note, I would like to thank you for taking part in the webinar. It's really been a pleasure talking to you. Do keep me posted on how you're getting on, because I'm always interested to hear about the challenges people face and work with them to find a solution to get things done. Thank you for listening. A very short survey will launch immediately after the webinar closes, and I would be very grateful if you could take a minute to provide us with your comments. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing from you.